All right. Here we go. How we doing, Paul? How's your Sunday going? Also, welcome to the community, man. Have a look at some of these questions. Hey, Cairo. How's it going, buddy? Welcome to the team. Oh no, it's Lloyd. It seems that he's super excited again. Hey! Doing good, chilling, doing a little game art. Yeah, nice. Yeah, I'm probably gonna do the same today. Aw, I'm sorry, Lloyd. No, I'm excited, man. I'm excited to have you here. That monkey emoji is so sad, by the way. The one that you posted first. Hey, Leon. How's it going? Hydrate already, Fran. Jeez. Here we go. I still need to do something about that hydrate timer. I keep forgetting, so I'm probably gonna get spammed again with it. I mean, me calling it out is only making it worse, so, I mean, we'll have to deal with that. How are you doing, Fran? Just gonna wait a couple of minutes, and then we get started. And then we'll dive straight into a little bit of a deeper breakdown into like the second UV workflow. Gonna go into the mask generation and also the shader setup. We'll start with that first. Hey, Christian, how's it going, man? Hell yeah. Let's double check that we don't have any anonymous questions. I don't think we do. Let's have a quick look, see. Nope. Doesn't seem to be anything in there. Cool. Doing good. Doing good. Got to finish my project in the next 7 days, and a lot more time is spent on technical stuff that isn't environments. But what can you do? Yeah, I mean, that's a part of the thing, right? If you're not working on an environment specifically, you're doing like a kind of a game, right? So a lot of technical stuff comes into it. But hey, maybe after that you have like another thing lined up. I think you mentioned it before, right? Weren't you going back to your environment after that? Hope everyone is doing good. Ready to be enlightened. Ta ta ta. I love it, Lloyd. I love it. It's more of an engine blueprint course, so I had a lot to do with that right now. Yeah. Do we? Man, this should be a question that I should know the answer to, right? Do I have control over the highlight color? I think I should do, right? Something to look up to. All right, let's get started. Let's dive into it. So again, the first question is from a Polygon. I'm currently exploring the secondary UV set technique, which was covered in this week's blog. Yep, that was the basic setup. And we're also going to do like an expansion on that next week. So that's gonna dive more into like the shader setup and like the mass generation a little bit. But his question is there any chance you could explore them a little bit more into detail? I'm curious to learn more about the mass generation and shader setup within Unreal to facilitate their usage. Yo, let's dive into it. Let me switch over my screen. What is it? This one. Yeah. So, first of all, let's dive into the mass generation setup, right? I think this was already mentioned in the blog before, but I'll go through it. I'm basically making use of 4 new channels here, which you can add with these user channels. You can see that one, well, I think it's 0 through 3 is already occupied because I have 4 channels here. And I basically renamed them to like the red channel, green channel, blue channel, and alpha channel, because we're gonna pack them together in one RGBA texture. So those are the channels that we're using, and I'm already previewing one of those. So I'm previewing the red channel at the moment. There are different ways that you can preview these, or you can even build your own smart material inside of Substance Designer. That makes it a little bit easier to do this kind of setup. So you could basically set up a smart material that already has those those channels packed into it, and then use that smart material inside of Substance Painter. So that is also an option. I haven't dived into that myself just yet. That's why I'm using this more, I would say, manual setup. But I'm planning to do like a little bit more investigation on like the smart material way in the future. And then what I do here is, in the beginning, how I had my shader set up was a bit more specific than I'm using now. So the red channel was always going to be dirt. The green channel was always going to be moss. The blue channel was always going to be like water damage. And then the alpha channel was empty. That's how I had set it up first. But now the red and the green are standardized in a way. So I can basically plug in the texture maps that I want. And it's how should I say it? It's a bit more normalized. Like I don't cater the nodes in my shader specifically to a dirt setup. It's more like a general setup that I'm using now. So in this case, nothing really changed, but let's say I'm using the shader on a wall. I could then use that for, I don't know, stones, for example, like stone debris or whatever that I want on the wall. But anyway, so you can see that I have like a bunch of stuff set up in here already. Most of it, when I'm building these, I rely on generators. The reason for that being is, if I want to set up a new asset, I can just drag that into this file, save it out to a new name, and I still have like all the same information roughly. So for the dirt example, I start with a dirt mask. Then I also apply a position mask to it, because like a wheelbarrow, you would expect it to be like dirty at the bottom, right? So that's basically what I'm doing here. Then on top of that, I can go in with like a paint layer and like really go in to like specific spots where I wanna apply like more dirt, for example. So in this case, because this is like a market wheelbarrow, right? The wheels are going to be really dirty because I have a lot of mud in my scene. That's why I just painted them white. Also, you can probably see that there is like the AO bake that I'm currently using. Yeah, that's also an important thing to mention. I bake the low poly onto the low poly basically. So no high poly required for this. But it's giving me some issues here, where these are decals that have transparency on the sides of it. So imagine that the white is dirt, you're probably gonna, well, you're gonna see through the opacity of the decal on top of it and straight onto dirt. So that's why I painted out a little bit. There are still some cases where you can see it, right? So I need to do like a little tweaking here if I wanted to. But the most apparent places have been cleaned up. So in this channel, you only have this one folder. Yep, I basically have a folder per channel. So I'm currently previewing the mask, the red mask, which is this folder specifically. And then if I want to do like the moss mask, I go into this folder, and then I need to switch the preview. And then you can see that this mask is for the moss, which looks completely different to the dirt one. But still, it uses the same sort of technique underlying it, right? It's all based on procedural generation. So again, I start with a dirt mask, but this time a really subtle one, because I only wanted to pop up in like certain crevices. And then I add a bit of a randomizer on this one with a curvature set to linear dodge, which adds it to it. And then I slow blur that to get a bit more randomization on this mask. You can see that this is with before, and then with the slow blur, it gives it like a more randomized result. And then there are some things that I tried out, like painting out the center of these planks, because again, because of the decals, I don't want them to show up on the decals. So I'm doing a little bit of manual work specifically to this asset. But this is something that I do after I've tested it in the engine and I know that the underlying masks are good, because I don't want to spend time on painting stuff out that I might need to remove with the generators anyway. If anyone has any questions about this, by the way, feel free to just drop it in the chat and I'll just clarify it on the go, right? Don't be afraid to just like interrupt me as I'm rambling through this. Yeah, and then the same for the blue mask. In this case, I've set it up to be a color variation. So what you're seeing here, all the white, is basically a mask where the colors are gonna be varying from like the base color that I'm using. So let's have a look at what that looks like, right? So this is the asset that we had in Substance Painter. And if I make it really apparent, let's have a look here. I did some adjustments quite recently. Where did oh yeah, I made that a global parameter. Sec. So materials collections. Let's make it really apparent, right? So this is a color variation mask that I'm using. You can see that it's corresponding to this mask that I have here, right? And that's also how I'm generating a variation between the planks. So instead of making it full white, I'll probably set it to like a subtle color, and then also play around with the overlay strength that I have on here, so that you can get some subtle variations in it. Even this might be a little bit too strong, but you see where this is going, right? And then if I wanted more different colors of planks, I could just go into my paint layer, and I could just pick out like different spots that I wanted to paint. Oh, it's this one. Why did you bake low poly to low poly with this? To give me information that I can then use in the generators. So the curvature map is going to be baked out, the normals, the ambient occlusion is going to be baked out, and that information is then used in the different generators. So for example, if we go back to the red mask, the dirt, you can see that the dirt is using these image inputs. So like ambient occlusion, curvature, world space, normal, and position. That's why we need those. Like if we don't have all these maps, it's not gonna generate anything. Hey, Ryan. Wanted to drop in and then say hi before going to sleep. Yeah. Oh, thanks for dropping by, man. Have a good sleep. Right, but why not use a high poly? Because we don't need one. It's not gonna give us anything that we can use, right? Because normally what you would use a high poly for is to get normal information from the high poly onto the low poly. But we can't really use that in this case because we're already using the first UV set for our trim sheet normals that we're using. I mean, you could technically do it, right? But the gain that you're going to get from it versus the time that you're going to spend on it is going to be fairly minimal. There's no real reason why you would do it, because the only thing that we're looking here is for the mask information. We only want to use that to layer on top of it. Plus, if we have an additional normal map, that's going to bring in like another texture input again. And that's going to make the shader more expensive too. Hey, Ryan. Thanks, man. Have a good night. I mean, there might be cases where you want to do something like that, right? Can I think of one? I was first thinking about maybe rocks, but then you would just use like a tileable detail normal instead of like a baked down normal. I can't really think of an example for that one. Because you already have the normal map from the one below, right? So say in this case, I am using trim sheets, but you can also just have a unique asset underneath this and then use the same second UV structure to build on top of it, right? If you have a look at the latest video series that Quixel put out, that's exactly how they add additional layers on top of their scans. They use a second UV workflow to then add additional moss, add like additional color variation, make it more run down, and set it apart from like the base scans that they're using. So this is not limited to like trim sheets. This can be applied to anything. Usually you don't want to use it on unique assets where you have all the creative control over, right? So say you're authoring your own high to low poly asset, then there's no reason to have these additional layers because you can implement those inside of the normal texture. Well, the base texture, not the normal texture, because that's going to be confusing. Yeah. And then the last mask here I'm using for water. So this is some water discoloration that I'm using. What is a good example? I think there are some examples here. I was working on, yeah. So you can see that it has like some watermarks. I still need to refine the mask for this one, but you get the idea, right? There's also this one where you can see like the water like pooling up on some of the planks, which is pretty neat. I like that. Hey, Bikes 3D, how's it going? So, yeah, that is it for the mask generation part, right? So let's dive into the actual shader setup now. This might look daunting, but don't get scared by what you see here. It's it's basically just like multiple layers blending on top of each other, based on this mask. So these are the base textures, right? This section. Let's make it simple as possible. And then this is my first material layer that I layer on top of it. So in this case, that could be the dirt. And then for like the second material layer, I'm using moss. And you can see that these are all like texture inputs, right? And I can replace them with any texture that I want. Where before this was specifically catered to like a dirt texture. Now I just have these material inputs that I can swap on the fly. Currently, I'm trying out some stuff with the height map, but this is, you can ignore this basically. This is not being used at the moment. Let's have a look. Yep, these are just tiling materials. Exactly. So this is a tileable dirt. It's the exact same dirt as I'm using on the floor here. Well, minus the rocks. I'm using the variation that I have without any rocks. So it's basically the same texture that I'm using. And the second one is the moss, and that's also just like a tileable texture. And then this is where they all come together. So you can see that I'm making material attributes. So that is basically combining all the stuff that you see from the base texture inputs. That goes into this node. And then I do the same thing for my first material layer. I make those material attributes, and that goes into this function. And then, where did it go? Oh, that's so annoying. Come on, get over here. Material attributes for the win, yeah. And then we get into this node, which breaks those material attributes again. And then blends the base color according to a height lerp. And then does the same for the metallic. And it does the same for the roughness. And it does the same for the normal. So this might look like a very complex thing, but it's actually pretty simple. It's just taking the base color from both texture layers. It's combining it. So like this is the base. This is the top layer, I think. Or like A is the base layer and B is like the layer that goes on top of it. The transition phase is the vertex color blended with my mask. So what that is going to give me is it gives me additional control on top of my mask. So I have the mask as a base, and then I can paint out like sections of the mask if I wanted to, or like completely remove it. So I could have one card that has like all the layers on top of it, but then I could also have a card that only has the moss layers affecting it, for example, with a different material instance, right? So yeah, this is the height map. I was testing some stuff. You can basically ignore this. Because I'm not changing that. And then I have like a contrast, which I have it outside of the node because I want to control this on a channel by channel basis. So I have like a contrast here. And that allows me to just tweak the contrast of the mask a bit. I can show that off real quick. Let's have a look-see here. So that's this. The red layer, desaturation, contrast. So if I turn that all the way to 0, you can see that there's no contrast. Then if I turn it up, 1 is basically the mask that I'm using. And then if I turn it up higher, it's going to be contrasting more. So it's going to be taken away from the mask. So it gives you like a lot of control. And then factor that in with vertex paint, right? it gives you, I mean, it gives you like endless opportunities. Don't want to miss any questions in the chat, right? So this is also how I'm doing these pots, by the way. And then this allows me to, I have one version of clean pottery, and then I have like a second version of clean pottery with a different color. So I can just drag these on. I get like different colors, and this is all using the same texture maps, right? And then for this one, I use like a slight dust layer with like some color variation again. You can see that on the bottom where you have these darker spots. And then you have like this rim on top of it. That's also how I'm creating this dust layer on top of the plates. So like all this stuff is driven by one set of textures and one master material, basically. Let me see. I think that's mostly it, right? Because the stuff that's coming behind this is basically doing the same thing again, but for the second material layer. And then this last part is the water that I'm adding onto it. So this water is not using any texture inputs. It's just using the information that I already have, desaturating it a little bit on the base color, and then changing the roughness value. And that just allows me to make this appear as being damaged by water. So I'm not pulling in any like new texture inputs because I don't want it to be super heavy, right? So that's how I'm creating like these water stains. Understanding this much better. Thank you. Yeah, no worries. No worries. I love doing these things on stream, by the way. So I don't mind. Let's have a look here. All right, that was a pretty long explanation, right, for the first question. But I'm glad it helped. So let's dive into the second question then. Let me go back to other scene. Hell yeah. All right. Can you talk about learning how to be faster? Not necessarily in terms of speed, but efficiency. Whenever I see it brought up, it's always downplayed because people will say you get faster with more experience, but not much is said about learning to be efficient. Yep. That's a good question, right? And I think I agree. I do also think that a lot of people mean efficiency, but they just mention speed of things. So especially when you're talking about environment art, right? Try to reuse as much as possible. Textures, models, assets. I mean, even shapes, right? Like all the stuff that I'm doing here in this scene is built from like a base set of what is it? Blanks, beams. Like I have basically my own Lego kit that I can play around with. And if I need like a bunch of, I don't know, in this example, like a bunch of, well, I'm looking at a stool at the moment. If I need like a set of legs, I can just take that from the stool and then apply that to like the next shape that I'm creating, right? That's how you should think about basically everything. If we take it away from purely environment art, think about shader setups that you can reuse. Like think about master materials in Unreal that you can reuse. Have an asset library where you have a bunch of pre-built shaders, pre-built materials that you have built up from like previous projects that can already give you like a good starting point. Or even if they're finished, right? Then you can just take that to the next thing and you have something ready to go. For example, that's why I'm spending so much time on this trim sheet that I'm working on. Also to get a good look in this environment. But let's say if I want to do like a varnished wood trim sheet, if I want to do, I don't know, like a Victorian scene with a lot of varnished wood, I can take the same trim sheet, just texture it differently, and I'm good to go. It's gonna take me like an hour, maybe, to get like a better, well, a more varnished look on it. And I'm ready to go again for my next scene, which is like completely different, right? Like an interior Victorian scene compared to like an outdoor medieval scene. So yeah, that's, yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects to this, right? Like even shapes, assets, materials, shaders, like anything that you can think of that can be reused, try to make it to like a quality level that you can reuse it in next environments or like in next projects. That's what I would say. It's probably the biggest thing. And I gotta be honest, I've always sucked at that really hard. Like I never really looked into how to reuse stuff or like how to build like my own asset library. And I'm only getting to that point sort of now, which did cost me a lot of time. But hey, that's how you learn, right? Learn from your mistakes. So that's a good question. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. Take a sip of water here. We're gonna go through 2 more questions, and then we're gonna dive into some of the chat questions, right? So if you have any questions for the chat, just feel free to drop them, and then we'll go through them. All right. Next, a question from Cairo. What are some things that you wished you had known or were thought before entering the industry that you see the value of now? There's like a second part of the question, right? It's basically the inverse. But let me think about this first. I mean, man, there's so many small things. Like I think the biggest thing that I'm currently like really happy with that I learned before going into the industry is I have a background of advertisement. I basically went into like advertisement design, like marketing design. This is before university, right? So this is high school, and all that stuff is really useful to me now. Like the usage of fonts, like how to basically design stuff that is appealing to people. How to use colors, how to use shapes, how to use composition, like 2D composition, right? To make stuff stand out, to pull attention to like certain things in I don't know, in like your promotional material or in like your thumbnails, for example, for ArtStation, or in blog posts or in articles or whatever that I'm doing. That is probably one of the most underrated things that I've taken with me, and is basically formed like this red line throughout the stuff that I'm doing. There are a lot of things though. So what did I wish that I had known before entering the industry? Definitely trim sheets. That is probably the biggest thing that I always missed out on. I never really had to look at trim sheets, never was really taught trim sheets. And if you see the power of trim sheets and just how quickly you can build up stuff with them, it's pretty crazy that we never really looked into that, to be honest. Yeah, definitely trim sheets, man. Maybe some things that you thought would be useful but weren't. Let's have a look. Thought would be useful but weren't. That's a good question. Trim sheets are the new material balls. To be honest, I don't know why it took so long. Like if you know the power, especially for an environment artist, right? Like if you know the power of them, like how quickly you can get stuff done with them. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Now everyone knows them because they're so popular. Maybe because the knowledge is more available. I don't know. I think people know what they are, but there's still a difference between people knowing what they are and then making them themselves. Because people probably look at trim sheets and then they're like, oh, that's cool. Like you can see this entire environment built by this. And then they get to a point where they need to plan or like design one themselves and they're like, oh my god, I don't know how to do this. And then they just revert to the high to low poly workflow. Yeah. It's definitely becoming more and more popular though. Or this hybrid way of thinking where people make unique textures but then reuse like sections of it, right? So say, I don't know, say there's like a part of a house that you built and it's all unique, but then you realize that you can reuse some of the beams to make like another section of a house with. And then I think that's how most people get started in it. And then if they take that extra step and realize what they're doing, they might be like, huh, wait, what if I just separate all of these elements out into like a separate texture and just build my own building kit, basically, like Lego. I think that's how it like organically goes with like a lot of students. Well, like people starting out. Yeah, it's a good question, Cairo. Maybe some things you thought would be useful but weren't. I can't really come up with one. I've been thinking about it this time, but because I definitely know some stuff that I don't use that I got taught before, right? But I never really thought that they were super useful. For example, I know how to animate, I know how to rig, I know how to program, I know how to script, I know all of that stuff. But well, to a certain degree, right? Like I'm not a pro in any of those things anyway because I'm an environment artist. But I always had this focus on environment art, so I never really thought that they were going to be useful. Yeah, it's a good question though, man. Now that trim sheets become more popular, UV masks need to be the next thing to make you stand out with your know-how. Yeah, and I think also the industry is more moving towards that, right? Especially if you look at the Quixel stuff with photo scans and photogrammetry. Like that is the way that you can layer stuff on top of it to really make it your own again, instead of just using the base photogrammetry assets that you get from Quixel, for example. That's how you can really make it your own. All right, last question from Fran. Hey Tim, a quick explanation about what the power of 2 is in Unreal and how or what for is it used? So I had to look into this, right? Because I had an assumption that it was just well, the assumption that I made was the power of 2 is how you always need to make your textures, right? That's why we have a standardized texture format, which is 128 to 56. Like we have these predefined texture sizes, right? That is due to a restriction from the game engines, where if you had like non-uniform sizes, or you had sizes that couldn't that weren't like 512 or 1024 or whatever, the engine couldn't render them. And that's also, I looked it up before the stream, that's also what's happening if you still want to render stuff on mobile. You need to have texture sizes that are conforming with those power of 2 texture sizes. If else, you're gonna get a weird issue where it's just gonna render out the textures saying that look into like the power of 2 option. But as we're moving away from that, right, more modern engines, they can handle like weird texture sizes. Normally, if you're aiming for like PC platforms, you don't really need to adhere to those rules anymore. But I think, and this is making an assumption, right? I'm not a technical person when it comes to that. I think there is still a performance reason why you should do it. Because it is, I assume here that it's still optimized for those, like power of 2 textures. So yeah, that's what I think about it. I had to look it up though, because I don't really build for mobile, right? And then the first thing that came up was people looking into like mobile resolutions, and they were like, oh, I have this weird texture bug. And it literally says like, look into the power of 2 option in the material editor or something. It's pretty weird. All right. We went through some of these questions. Let me double check if I have all the AMA questions. Yep, we're good. All right. Let's go through some of the chat questions then. If this is your first time joining, feel free to just drop any questions that you have about game development, environment art, portfolio work, anything like that in the chat, right? Leon, question. What makes a good master material? How many use cases should it cover? Should the majority... Oh, this is like 10 questions in one, Leon. What are you doing to me? Should the majority of assets in a scene be instances of the master material? Is it better to put all the possible functionality into one single master material with a lot of switches? Or would it be preferable to have different master materials for different special use cases? You have to look at the material in like material what is like texture samplers that you're putting in, and like the amount of instructions that the material instance is using. So for that case, I would... One question begets the next. Sorry. No, it's all good. It's all good. So let's break this down, right? So what makes a good master material? A master material needs to be useful enough so that it can be used on like a majority of the assets, but it can't also be a master material that's used on all assets, because then you're gonna run into issues with just like how many parameters that you're gonna add to it to make it really useful in like all use cases. So how I look at this, and I'm glad that you brought it up, I use one for my UV2 masks. I also use one for my foliage, for example, which has like the simple wind deforming it, and like has an opacity mask and has subsurface scattering. So that is like a completely different use case on the one end, right? And then we have like the UV2 mask, which is like the other side of the spectrum. So it doesn't really make sense to make like a really complicated shader with like lots of switches to have them work for like both cases. It's way easier to just have a master material for both. And then what I would also do is, if you're thinking about performance, this also comes with a huge caveat, right? That I've never really done a production in environment in Unreal Engine, right? But what I can tell from like the production environment is that you should also have a really simple base material. So for example, if you have like a high to low poly baked prop, you're not going to use a second UV you're not going to use a second UV shader with like everything disabled. That doesn't make sense. It makes more sense to have like a really simple master material for your unique assets or your hero assets, which are highly likely just going to be texture inputs with like a couple of adjustments to it, but nothing more. It's going to be fairly straightforward. It doesn't make sense to disable all the layers that you've built from a more elaborate master material. So yeah, I would start with like, if we're looking at the scene that I was just showing, right? The medieval scene that I'm working on. That's why I started with a shader that has like the 2UV workflow. And then for some of the simpler assets, the smaller assets, for example, I'm probably going to build like another master material that's just going to be like high to low poly assets. Just a really straightforward shader that's way cheaper than the second UV one. So yeah, I think that sort of covers all your questions, right? I'm just reading through it again. Yeah, and then apply the same for the Z up versus the Z up world material that you want to add, or your moss material that you want to add, or whatever, right? Let's have a look. Maybe I can ask this on this topic. Would you make your own master materials at work? Do you find that difficult getting to know all these setups with the in-house engines? Do you find that difficult getting to know all of these setups with the in-house engines? There's always gonna be parallels between the stuff that we're doing in Unreal versus the stuff that we're doing in-house, right? It's not gonna be 100% the same, but you can always sort of compare stuff. There might be different toggles that you need to switch. There might be different inputs that they're using, but the core thinking behind it is sort of the same if we compare the two workflows, like the two shader setups in this case. Hey Suzanne, hello, how are you doing? Speaking of mass materials, would you consider putting your 2UV shader up for sale? Would be an excellent case study example. So, in the long run, when I finish this environment, everything's going to be up for sale. There will be, because I did this with the last Bastion scene, right? There will be multiple asset packages. So if you don't want like the entire environment, there might be like a smaller pack where you can buy in for like a cheaper price and then really break it down. Also, keep an eye on the next block, right? We're gonna break down some of the shaders in there too. As you said, it's not gonna be 100% in your hands. I get that if you get to look at it on your own time, it's way better, right? So that's definitely gonna be up there when this is done. Let's have a look. Bikes, you had a question too. Should you build up a scene in 3D modeling software and import it into the engine? In what case would it not make sense to do so? And would it not make sense to do that? In what case not? That's a good question. That is a good question. If you're doing something unique and you don't need to make like another half of a city with the same building blocks, then just do it in the modeling package. It also depends on your familiarity, right? I'm probably more comfortable in Unreal Engine than in Blender, for example, because I know how the shaders work exactly in Unreal Engine. I don't know how the shaders all work. I have a pretty good understanding, and I could probably do the setup in Blender, but I'm so fluid in Unreal Engine and also lighting it that, I mean, it makes more sense for me to get it in the engine as quick as possible and then build it up there. But there are, for example, games that have been built primarily in like a 3D modeling package. The Surge 2, for example, if you look at breakdowns for that game is literally entire levels built in Maya, I think. And then they completely export that as like one thing to get it into the game engine. So all the setup and all the logic is done in Maya. So it can be done. In my case, I like to work in like a really modular building way, right? Let's go back to my scene just quickly here. If you just look at all this stuff that I'm building, this is perfect for like a modular type of style. Like I'm basically only building like the individual Lego pieces, right? And then I do the composition inside of Unreal Engine, like you can see here, like building all these different houses. It gives me a lot of creative freedom inside the engine. You could technically do this step inside of Blender as well, like in your modeling package. But this is where it comes down to personal what is it? Personal, not satisfaction, but like your personal workflow, or like what you like to do, or what you want to work in. And I prefer Unreal Engine over this. So yeah, think about what you like the most, like where you like building stuff the most, and follow that. It's a good question though, Bikes. It's a good question. I think a lot of people think about this. But for example, there's people that I'm talking to that make almost their entire scenes in Maya or in Blender or in their modeling package, and then they only do like the lighting and post-processing inside of Unreal Engine. That's fair. There's no real bad way of doing this, really. It all works. Gears of War as well. Oh shit, I didn't know that. Polygon. I find taking things apart really helps me understand them. Yeah. I've never done that before. I've been talking to some people that bought like asset packages before to break them down. And seeing the value that they get out of it makes me think about maybe buying some stuff myself too. I think there's some really interesting stuff there. Do you get any lighting issues when it comes to many modular pieces? If I were to use static lighting, yep, for sure, there would be light bleed. There's all sorts of ways that you can avoid this, right? Unreal Engine does like a great job of explaining it. Say, for example, not using, always leave like a little bit of padding on like the edges for light bleeding. There's a lot of good resources on that. Most of my stuff that I do, because I hate baking, honestly, is all real time. So like movable lights, I do make a sacrifice when it comes to GI, right? So I'm not getting like good GI, so I'm probably gonna experiment with like some static stuff in here, but I haven't gotten to that point yet. All my scenes, because of that reason too, that you just brought up, I've done in movable lights. Especially when it comes to outdoor scenes, like there's no real reason to use static lights unless you have maybe corners like this where you want to have like more interesting GI bouncing. That could be like an example. Or let's say if you want to do like interiors in this space, right? That's where you would need static lighting. For sure. Oh, I just realized that I wasn't sharing my screen. Anyway, nothing exciting happening anyway. Hey Raj, how you doing, buddy? Bikes, do you think static lighting will be replaced in the future by dynamic lighting and ray tracing? In the future, yeah, for sure. When we're gonna get to that point, that's a different question, right? Because I think this is something that Clinton Crumpler, Jesus Christ, brings up in some of the podcasts that he does, is that he keeps mentioning the fact that Unreal Engine 4 came out with this big promotional push that they were saying that you would never have to bake light maps ever again. And I mean, a couple of years later, we're still doing it. So it's not going to replace it immediately. But the system that they put in place is what excites me the most about Unreal Engine 5. It's not the infinite amount of polys that you can technically use, right? We'll see about that one. But it's the dynamic lighting. That is something that is, oh man, that's super exciting for me. Like I'm hyped for that. Because that is something that is tangible. Like that is real. There's no denying it. Whereas the poly count, right? I'm curious to see how that's gonna work in like an actual production environment. I'm skeptical about that one. Because we're also talking about like many restrictions on file sizes. I mean, this has been brought up by a ton of people before. So at this point, we're kind of beating a dead horse, right? But I'm curious to see where that goes. If it works, that would be fucking great. but we'll see about that one. But however, I'm really excited about the dynamic lighting, and I think as we're moving to GPUs that have dedicated cores for like ray tracing, like the RTX cores, and seeing as consoles are now using it too, right? In some way or another. Oh, I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, I got distracted there. Accident into but yeah, anyway, like I'm really excited for the dynamic lighting and ray tracing. Oh yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like consoles are using ray tracing as well, right? I'm still looking out for an RTX card myself. I'm waiting on the 3080 Ti announcement, but they delayed that one. But yeah, I'm really curious to try it myself. I haven't tried ray tracing myself, so I think that's gonna be, that has the potential to be like a big, well, it already is like a big game changer when it comes to lighting. Oh, hydrate. Thanks, Leon. Honestly, you can use a lot of polys in Unreal Engine 4. Yep. Yeah, I think so too. Like the millions of polys that you can already use. This is also like another part of the equation, right? Polys are getting cheaper and cheaper. Like, well, cheaper to render, that is. So it's not out of the equation to think that you could ever get to a stage where we saw in like the Unreal Engine 5 demo, right? But yeah, there's still the question of texture sizes, like file sizes and all that stuff. Honestly, you can use so many polys by now. Lighting and texture sizes are way more interesting. Yeah, I think so too. I agree. What do you all think in the chat? Do you think that static lighting is going to be replaced by dynamic lighting and ray tracing? Because I mean, if it is, I mean, it's going to. I don't think there's like denying that it's ever not going to be. If we look at the exponential growth of the power of like mobile processors and mobile GPUs and all that stuff, like stuff is going to be crazy in like 50 years. Going to be so spoiled with like the graphics that we're going to get on like the tiniest screen, like the lightest the lightest mobile devices. It would be cool, but it will take at least 5 more years until static will be done for good. GPU light mask with virtual textures is already pretty quick. Virtual real-time upgrades, pretty nice. Yeah, real-time is the future. 100%. I agree on that. You always have to develop thinking about the weakest link, and a lot of people are still running GPUs that don't support it. Yep, exactly. But that's also the interesting thing about the prices going down on GPUs, right? I don't know if that's not going to be a trend that we're going to see for the next coming years, I think, but I mean, it's pretty crazy what you can get, especially in the latest line of GPUs. Well, if you can get them, right? Oh, sorry. But yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. There's always like this big turnaround for, like you said, maybe in 5 years, like the people that are currently on like the lower end of graphics to be catching up with that stuff. Yeah, I'm curious. I am curious. Real time is definitely the future for sure. That's also what's interesting about Unreal Engine, right? If you're, I think this was brought up in a podcast as well by our station, by the way. But this is something that I've seen working in Unreal Engine from UDK times, right? is the way that they're positioning themselves. And like they have these collaborations with like real big movie productions right now, where they're really trying to push the limits, where it's not only a game engine, but just like a render engine. Like it can render real-time stuff, like for high quality production movie houses too, which is actually pretty crazy. So we're looking at the convergence of rendering by itself. Well, maybe not rendering, right? Because simulation rendering is still, I mean, it's still crazy intensive. But if we're talking about games and movies, like the rendering for that is gonna come closer and closer. Like there's a convergence happening at the moment, which is super exciting. It's not as bad as in web dev, but still bad if you're eagerly waiting to develop with the next newest tech. Yeah, that's also a thing that I think about, right? We have these we're talking to the spectrum of Unreal Engine, but there are other like in-house engines that we need to keep in mind too, right? Where they might be developing stuff slower compared to Unreal Engine, because Unreal Engine is only focused on like the engine itself. I mean, they have development teams too, but I assume because it's a publicly available engine and that it's being used by other studios, that they have a way larger team developing the actual engine underneath it than some in-house teams have available to them. What would your go-to method be for placing bricks to a castle or a wall or something in ZBrush, geometry, IMM, displacement, noisemaker, drag rectangle? Placing bricks to a castle wall. What are you talking about? Like high poly? To then bake down to a low poly? Or actually placing individual bricks on a wall? Less screens and stuff they're using for the Mandalorian with Unreal Engine 4 is so cool. Yeah! Yeah, that stuff looks awesome. For the high poly. Okay. I mean, if we're baking it down to a tileable, you can probably do it by hand. I mean, there's no wrong way to do it. You could use like insert brushes. You could use particles if you wanted to. If I'm doing something like this myself, I am probably doing it either in ZBrush or in Blender by hand, just to really make it unique. Or, I mean, if we're talking about making a tileable in the end, I would also use maybe something like Substance Designer, where I bake down the height map of a couple of bricks and then use those height maps to scatter and like make tileable out of. That's also another option. It depends what you're looking for. If you want to have a wall with high detail, if you really want some of the bricks to pop out and all that stuff, then you would probably need to go for like the more manual approach, in my opinion, where you build it in ZBrush, manually moving it into place, having I don't know how it's called, but like an infinite, it's not an infinite, I forgot what it's called in ZBrush. It's been a while since I've done it. Like basically a tileable work region, so that if you place a brick on the right, it's going to be coming in on the left, so that it's really easy to make the tileables and that you know where you need to place your bricks. So yeah, that's how I would do it. All right, people. I don't think we have any more questions coming in, so this is gonna do it for this week, I think. This was an awesome episode again. I like all the questions that you guys had, all the good thoughts, all the interesting topics being discussed. So I appreciate you all being here, and I wish you all a happy Sunday. Talk to you all later. See ya.